All right, guys. So, like I said, we're going to start a new session now on the various disciplines of emergency management. All right. Don't forget that when we talked about emergency management cycle, we said that it goes all the way from uh, mitigation. So we had mitigation. Okay. And they said this goes all the way to preparedness. Okay. And this goes all the way to response. Okay. And to recovery. Okay. Back to mitigation. All right. So this is the emergency management life cycle. All right. And we're going to start with the very first one, which is mitigation. Okay. So here, basically, you should be able to describe the emergency aims of emergency mitigation, describe a range of structural mitigation for various hazards, non-structural mitigation as well, key steps that can be taken to conduct mitigation planning. All right. So mitigation actually means the means for reducing the impact of hazard. So basically what we're trying to do is to reduce the impacts, okay? Especially for natural hazard, we cannot control or stop its occurrence. What we can do is to reduce its impact. And this is defined as a sustained action, okay, to reduce or eliminate the risks to people and property from such hazards and their effects. This is what the definition of emergency mitigation. Now, mitigation looks at long-term solutions to reducing risks as opposed to preparedness for hazard. And this is because some people may say that the first step in emergency management is preparedness rather than mitigation. However, mitigation comes before preparedness in the sense that mitigation looks at long-term solutions by designing community or by designing for resilience in the community or designing the community to be resilient. Okay, so this look at long-term solutions, whereas preparedness is uh, an action that prepares you for immediate response, an action that is meant for immediate response to a hazard, okay, or short-term recovery from a hazard event. Preparedness is all about being prepared to respond to a hazard and recover from it. However, mitigation looks at a long-term approach whereby you design your community, you design your systems in such a way that you are less vulnerable to the impact and the effect of hazards. Now, another thing that sets mitigation apart from other disciplines of emergency management is participation and support of a broad spectrum of players. Now, this is because mitigation, you're going to have various people from policymakers, okay, from policymakers, town planners, okay, engineers, okay, administrators, all these various people will be involved during the mitigation phase because they all have roles to play when it comes to community development and developing infrastructure. However, when it comes to preparedness, then this is usually specific to those that participate in emergency management, those that are directly involved in emergency management. All right. So mitigation will involve land use planners, construction and building officials, public and private business owners, insurance companies, community leaders, and politicians. All these people will be involved in the mitigation process. Now, the skills and tools for accomplishing mitigation, such as planning expertise, political acumen, marketing and public relations, and consensus building, are different from operational skills, first responder skills that more often characterize emergency management professionals. That's because emergency management professionals are more interested in this area, okay, operational and first responder skills, because they will basically be responding to the hazard, okay. While mitigation, people involved in mitigation will be involved more in planning and policy, okay, and policy formation. Now, with the exception of fire community, whose members were early leaders in the effort to mitigate fire risk through support for building codes, code enforcement, and public education, The emergency management committee has remained focused on their preparedness planning and response obligations. So basically, the emergency management committee, which involves civil defense and all those other people involved in emergency management, they are more interested in what? In preparedness planning, with the exception of members that have had early efforts in mitigation, such as firefighters and those that develop building codes and those that enforce the building codes from the municipality. Now let's look at mitigation tools. Now there are different types of mitigation tools, okay, and there are very few. Like most practitioners argue that the primary intent of mitigation is to ensure that very few communities and individuals become victims of disaster. This simply means that the main aim of mitigation is to ensure that the community becomes more resilient community. Okay, so we are trying to, and you see, for example, when we talk about the examples of mitigation tools, you see how this fits into this overall objective to ensure that the community is more resilient to hazards. So the goal of mitigation is to create economically secure, socially stable, better built, and more environmentally sound communities out of harm's way. An example of that includes one, hazard identification and mapping, as you shall see. Design and construction is another example of mitigation. 3, land use planning. 4, financial incentives. 5, insurance. And 6, structural controls. As for hazard identification and mapping, this is a way to identify the various hazards that can affect your community. And mapping them means to identify what are the areas that are more susceptible or that are more vulnerable to these hazards. Let me say, for example, in Jeddah, we know that Jeddah is more susceptible to floods, okay? Floods to Jeddah, okay? Jizan, we could have rock falls in Jizan. Rock falls in Jizan. Also, we could have earthquakes in Jizan. Also, earthquakes in Jizan. So this is what you call mapping the hazards, knowing what area of coverage the hazard is applicable to. The next one is design and construction applications, developing building codes, okay, like the Saudi building code, whereby how these hazards, designing and construction of buildings, how these hazards may be taken care of through the design and construction of buildings and infrastructure. Land use planning, which involves planning shelter or planning flood areas and things, flood plains and things like that, or creating a ban or prohibiting the development of settlements in particular areas because of the hazards characteristic of those areas. Also, financial incentives to develop communities to be more resilient, or it could be in terms of collecting tax from the people to develop emergency mitigation strategies and plans. Something else could be insurance, okay? And this is basically transfer of the risk, okay? This is transfer of the risk to insurance companies, okay? This is another way insurance can be used as a mitigation tool. Something else is structural controls. Structural controls basically involve systems designed, okay, to systems designed as structural controls for hazard mitigation and things like that, okay? So we see examples of that. Now, one of them is called hazard identification and mapping. So most practitioners agree that primary intent of mitigation is to ensure that fewer communities and individuals become victims of disasters. The most essential part of any mitigation strategy or plan is an analysis of what the hazards are in a particular area, and resources for hazard identification are numerous, okay? Now, so basically what you want to do here is that you want to know what are the hazards in a particular region. And how you do this, there are various ways to do this. One typical way is to use what you call the GIS, Geographic Information System. And this has become very famous, very popular, and are staples for all local planning organizations. And is used by a lot of planning organizations, geographical information systems in planning and also in identifying floods, plains, identifying flood hazards, carrying out flood risk assessment, and other forms of natural hazards. Now, what is often missing from the available tools is the ability to superimpose human and built environment onto the hazards, thereby providing a quantified level of risk. So some of these tools have their own limitations in carrying out proper risk assessment. So you may need to combine these tools with other methods to properly identify and map the risk. Now, this is an example of a map. As you can see in this image, you have winds, blowing from this direction, okay, into Saudi Arabia. Usually you see some of these types of things in the news when they talk about the weather. So they can tell you if there's any issue or any direction. They can tell you what areas the winds are blowing, okay, and where are the areas where you might have potential hazardous scenarios depending on the wind direction and depending on the weather direction. All right, so you call this mapping. You could also have what you call design and construction, which provides one of the most cost-effective means of addressing risks. The process is governed by building codes, architecture and design criteria, soil and landscaping considerations. Okay, so this can help you define, uh, create a means to address risks. We have code criteria that report risk reduction, usually apply only to new construction, substantial innovation, or innovation to change the type and use of the building. So usually when you talk about code, basically you can only apply codes when you have a new construction, that's a new building, or you're making a new renovation or remodeling of the building. Now, because of the cost, codes require rehabilitation of existing potentially hazardous structures have been rarely implemented. There's also what you call the performance-based design and construction, which is becoming very critical, especially in earthquake-prone areas. So you have buildings in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Japan. Basically, most of them follow what you call performance-based design or PBD, okay, or PBD approaches. Okay, but we don't have that much of it in Saudi Arabia, so you don't have a lot of people that are into this. Okay. Now let's talk about land use planning. The strategies for land use planning offer many options for effective mitigation, including acquisition, there's acquisition of land, easements, okay, storm water management, designing areas to take the storm, annexation, joining other areas from land, environmental review, floodplain management plans. So all these are various techniques that can be used in land planning or land use planning. Also, it also encompasses a myriad of zoning options such as density controls, special uses permits, historic preservation, coastal zone management, and subdivision controls. So land use planning was one of the earliest tools used to encourage mitigation. Local communities could determine location of floodplains, okay, and state development away from these areas. Yeah, and so when you have an area where there's a lot of water being collected when there's a flood or a rain, people can move their construction or development away from this area. So they will not build in the areas where you have a lot of floods. So they move their structures out of harm's way. True property acquisition is the most effective use land use planning tool, but it's also the most costly. So sometimes what government could do is that if people have built houses in a place where there's usually a lot of floods, what government could do is to relocate these people away from this area, all right, and then pay them, compensate them. Just like what they're doing in Mecca during the expansion of the Haram. You see that they move some hotels away, they demolish the hotels, and then they compensate the owners of the hotels. So similar thing, when you have flood people, they've built houses in flood-prone areas or floodplains. These people could be moved away from the floodplains, and they could be compensated. So the government will buy the land from them, and the government will reserve the land for as a floodplain. So you can see an example here, just behind the city. You can see you have the city over here. Okay, you have the city over here, and right here you have this area, which is a swampy area, and nobody will come and build houses here, okay, because it's going to be designated as a floodplain. Now, if people were to come and make some development here, then there's going to be a problem on how this water is going to flow. Okay, where is this water going to flow to? All right, so it's going to lead to some problems for the people in controlling floods. Something else what we call financial incentives. Okay, financial incentives basically involves tools for for example, tax, collecting government collecting tax from people or giving people grants. Okay, it could be in form of tax or grants, basically. Okay, okay, could be in form of tax or grants. So financial incentives tools is an emerging area for promoting mitigation. Now, the approaches used by localities to reduce risk are creating special tasks assessments, okay, by giving special tax assessments, okay, passing tax increases or bonds, okay, paying for mitigation, offering location assistance, okay, to people. That is grants. You can call this grants, okay, and targeting federal community development or renewal grant funds for mitigation. Other emergency areas of financial tools include special assessment districts, impact fees, transfer of development rights, and basically some of these concepts usually are used by governments. Of course, they involve more detailed definitions and all that, but they're usually used by the authorities or government bodies in mitigation. Okay, basically how to give money to people or take money from the people just for the sake of mitigation. So all these tools provide either incentives, okay, just by giving people money, okay, incentives like grants, or penalties by taking money from the people to developers as a means of promoting good risk reduction development practices. So basically, this is the overall idea. Yani, there can be many ways that they use in the government from country to country, what system they are using. But the bottom line is either they're giving incentives to people in the form of grants, or they're taking money from people in form of tax or penalties and things like that. We also have insurance, okay? Insurance means you transferring the risk to an insurance company. So the organization could transfer the risk, okay? You could transfer the risk to an insurance company. Some people might argue that insurance is not a mitigation tool. And that's because you are transfer, like we said, you are transferring the risk. You are not eliminating or treating the risk. You are not treating the risk. All right? You've only taken the risk from yourself and you've given it to somebody else. And this is why some may say insurance might not necessarily be a mitigation tool. So the reason, like I said, the reason is that insurance by itself really only provides for a transfer of the risk from the individual or community to the insurance company. So it's not like you're treating the risk or you're eliminating the risk or you're reducing the risk. You just simply transfer it. Although this is true, here is saying that if properly designed, the insurance mechanism can be a good tool for mitigation. And that is because if you have an effective insurance system and people know that they have to pay a lot of money in terms of incentives, okay, to the insurance companies. They have to pay a lot of incentives to insurance companies. This will make them, or this will force them to be what? More responsible, okay? This will be force them to be more responsible, right? So that they don't pay higher insurance premiums, right? They try to be more make risk-based decisions, okay? So that the insurance money they pay will be less, okay? And they don't have to pay a lot of money to insurance companies. So in this case, it could be an effective mitigation tool, right? Now, major disasters commonly instigate changes within the national, international, private insurance industries, as first attempts are just operations so that they are able to continue profitable operations according to newly acquired assigned information. So basically what this simply means is that when you have major disasters like the Piper Alpha and Texas BP incident and all this will make various changes within the insurance industries, all right, in terms of how much they charge in insurance and how they assess the risks, okay, in terms of risk, in terms of insurance premiums, okay, how much insurance premiums they're going to charge, okay, and also firms will be more sensitive. Insurance companies will be more sensitive to risks, as well as firms. Different companies will also be more sensitive to risks. Okay, so that brings us to the end of session one. Because in session two, we're simply going to talk about structural controls. Okay, and the various types of structural controls that are inherent of emergency management. In other words, I mean structural controls in terms of flood control, erosion, coastal erosion controls, all these things. And we're going to see also the various pictures for these various types of structural controls. So this first part today simply talks about the various types of land use mitigation tools. We have about 6 of them. Today we've talked about 5 of them, right, in brief. Where we've discussed uh, hazard identification all the way to insurance. All right. So at this point, we bring the lecture to an end for now. So